Yesterday, when last we were talking, I asked you to think about, how this is all connected and how this all matters and how 1920, 2020, 1420, 1320 all seem to have this thing in common. And so now we're going to look at what happens after. We're going to look at this Renaissance, the thing that comes out of the Middle Ages that ends with the Black Death, which is why I love the fact that this slide is first, because it allows you to think about then with yourself now. I mean, it would be just as easy to change that to imagine that you live in Manhattan, New York, or in Wuhan, China, or in Madrid, Spain, immediately following the COVID-19 outbreak. You know, you survived, but many around you have not. Describe how the environment has changed. Describe how you think you would feel, whether it's now or during the Black Plague. Excuse me. How would you have felt if you were a survivor? There's a psychological term called survivor's guilt, where people feel bad that they're the ones who live. This happens a lot um, in plane crashes and accidents where a number of people die and one person lives. This idea that, why should I survive? But you have survived, and now you have an obligation to move forward, to not let it repeat itself. The people of Europe and Asia, for that matter, during the Middle Ages, who went through the bubonic plague, um, didn't have the benefit of science like we do. They didn't have the benefit of anything, but they had tomorrow, which is the same thing we have today. So let's look at what they did with their tomorrow. So let's begin with the simple definition. What does Renaissance mean? And it means rebirth. Is the period after the Middle Ages. It is the period before the Enlightenment, to do a little historical foreshadowing there. But this begs another question: what's being reborn? What is it about the Renaissance that is so different that it gets its own little name? Because it just follows the 500 years that came before it. So let's find out. Also remember, sorry, a little housekeeping thing. At any time you're taking notes or you want to stop and pause and write stuff down, that's the beauty of this. You can pause and write stuff down. You can go back and get something. These PowerPoints will help you answer the questions in those digital assignments that I've given you. It just gives you a little more information to help you out, and it can also help you with your vocabulary. So here we go. All right. The early Renaissance. This is the first part. This is the part that begins in Italy, as evidenced by this picture. The Renaissance begins in Italy, and it begins in Italy for those reasons that we were talking about before we left. I know, jog your memory a little bit. Remember, Constantinople was the big dog, and then during the Fourth Crusade, the Pope said, go make Constantinople not so rich, go rough it up a little bit. And eventually they do that, and Constantinople is never able to recover. And Italy and the states of Italy become the new center for trade and for the Renaissance and for the growth. Well, one of the places where Europe will become Europe. What was it again? It follows the Middle Ages. It lasts roughly 100 years. Remember, history is not nice and neat and all kind of clean. It lasts around 100 years. And also remember too in history that there's always overlap. It's not 1449, the Middle Ages ends. That's not how it works. It's just roughly during this time period. It's also important to note that during this 100-year period, it's not just in Italy. It is a rebirth, to go back to the previous slide, of classical Greek and Roman thinking. Remember a little bit here, when the Roman Empire falls, part of the reason the church is able to gain so much power is because they looked at Rome falling, because Rome was, remember, pagan. Rome, some Roman leaders were Christian, but by and large the people weren't, and they saw Rome being destroyed as a sign from God. And so what happens during the Middle Ages is anything associated with Greece or Rome during that time period was seen as sinful or wrong, and you wanted no part of it. because they were not one with God. So let's not be a part of it. So we turn from it. We have the church being in power. Remember, you have your neighbor, your little manor, and this group, all living separately, developing their own way of life without any thought to what was great 1,000 years prior. So that's part of the reason for that. It begins in Italy, obviously. Rome is in Italy. That's going to help. And it's also because, as I said, after the Fourth Crusade, Italy becomes the center of economic power and economic growth in Europe at the beginning of this time period. It's going to shift to France and then to England, but right now it's Italy. And like I said, it eventually moves into Northern Europe, the Second Renaissance or the High Renaissance, which we'll get to in a couple of days, is actually in Denmark, of all places, and up in Holland, and we'll get to that. All right. Also, if at any time you have questions, that's what office hours are for. For you guys, it is Tuesdays and Thursdays, 1 to 3, or anytime Friday except from 11 to 12. That's my lunch and my PLT. So, but anytime other than that, and then at night only if it's a really, really, really big emergency. So, one of the biggest changes of the Renaissance, and we talked about it a little bit, and go back to your notes and go look. We talked about how man during the Middle Ages, if you can remember, yell at your screen. But during the Middle Ages, man's sole purpose in life was to do what? I think somebody was correct. But that's what they did. They worked hard, they believed in their God, they prayed, and their reward came after death. If you led a good life, if you weren't excommunicated from the church, if you weren't a witch, if you didn't make any mistakes, you would get to heaven. So in the Middle Ages, it's find God, and you see the second one there, it's prove preconceived ideas. Basically, that means this is what we were told, so it is true. There's no questioning. That's what that sentence, that phrase means. That they didn't question anything. This is just the way it's always been. This is the way it is. This is just how it is. This is my life. This is what we're going to do. But something happens during the Renaissance, and the biggest thing, and I'm pretty sure it's coming up soon in these slides, is the concept of humanism, and we'll get back to that. It's also a vocab word. But by finding man, as it says here in the slide, it means to find man from an individual self. Like, I have value as a human being. And it's also important to note that this isn't in a selfish, egotistical way. The Renaissance was very religious. If I am created by God, then obviously I have to have value. So this is sort of a change that begins to slowly come about during this time period. And also the idea of learning for the sake of learning to actually prove other things, to disprove the preconceived notions from previous eras. So it's a big change, but also remember too, and you can guess how much of the population actually was Renaissance, like what portion of the population would have the time or the money to think about themselves beyond how do I feed my family, how do I pay my rent, how do I better myself. So it is a movement, but it's a small group of people. Now, this is very long. Take a minute and let you read it, and then we'll come back. Again, this just, if you need to, you can go back and read it later. I don't know how quickly some of you read, but this just restates what I just said, that the focus from being part of the whole, part of the Catholic Church or part of my community, it isn't gone, but a little bit of me matters. Like I have value, and this is a big fundamental change. This is a big shift um, that comes about during this time period. And again, the printing press is a big part of that. So here's the word I was talking about a second ago: the idea of humanism. This is the pursuit of, remember, ism, and ism is a belief. So humanism is the belief in the fact that you are human, and as a human, you are an individual. And as an individual, there are certain things that matter. Um, One, we are creative. Two, that what man creates with their hands, whether it be art from the purest, most literal sense, to pottery, to a building, to um, clothing, anything made by man that shows skill or deftness, anything that shows beauty, um, is valued. And it's also not a bad idea to go back to look at Greece and Rome and think about what they gave us and what they provided us, and to like that too. There's sort of like it's like being nostalgic. It's like um, people who like the 50s, or why a lot of the music today, a lot of music today sounds like music from the 80s, or borrows either styles from the 80s or actual songs from the 80s. Um, there's there's a fondness, and people like to go back to other eras and bring stuff and bring it home because it's kind of makes the future less scary. Now, this second bullet here about rejecting the importance of God, I'm not all in on this. And some may believe this. Obviously, I don't. I see this as a religious movement. You can enjoy life, but that's because God gives you the ability to do all these things. Um, this is not you forsaking God and just being selfish. That's not where humanism begins. Now, there may be people who go that way. There's always people who take things to the extremes. Um, but the Renaissance, generally speaking, and humanism, generally speaking, are deeply religious because they allow the individual to understand God better. Their relationship with God could be made better if they understood who they were, if they could appreciate art and see the beauty of God's hands in that art. Yes, there is an emphasis on reasoning things out and thinking things through. Yes, we do have the birth of scientific inquiry and the idea of experimentation. And yes, we should be fulfilled or find joy and satisfaction in the world around us. That being miserable now isn't necessary to still get to heaven later. So it's taking a step back and really looking at what it means to be alive or starting. And again, remember, small percentage of the population, most people are working and trying to get to heaven. They're on their mission. Now, why did this thing occur? And these are 6 very important things that play a large part in why the Renaissance occurred, and we'll go over all these. And again, because I'm talking, because these are slides, you can pause and write, and then come back and listen. Because of the Crusades, there was increased trade with the Middle East or Southwest Asia, and with Asia proper, with China and other places like India. And goods came back, and goods that the middle class could afford, they bought, and more people wanted them. So trade um, led to the Renaissance, because not only are people bringing back the literal goods from another part of the world, but when you go spend time anywhere, and we talked about this before, when you go spend time somewhere, you pick up part of where you were, and that comes back with you too. So maybe you bring back a dish that you like to eat, or maybe you bring back some clothing or some. Whenever we go to other parts of the world, whenever I go, like I go all the time. But the one time I went to England, we brought stuff back. When we go to Epcot, we go to the Japanese land, and my son gets all the candy that you can't get here. So something as simple as that, it comes back and it makes you curious about other things, or clothing, or books, or film, or whatever. So just because you come in contact with people, you pick up different things, and those can become part of your culture. With the Black Plague, remember, with so many people dying, feudalism struggles, and feudalism almost invariably dies. And it dies because, well, If you're the lord of the manor, your crops still need to be harvested. Your crops still need to be planted. And now there are fewer workers. So the workers could actually go from place to place and demand being paid and get wages. So the idea of feudalism, that whole arrangement, goes away. You start getting people who are making money, and people who have money get more money, and people who didn't have money get a little bit of money. So feudalism dies down. Cities begin to grow. Remember when Rome fell, people went their own separate ways, and there were some cities, but now now they grow, and they grow very large, and they become trading centers. Because of the Crusades and the Muslims actually keeping Greek and Roman literature and philosophy and thoughts alive by keeping the books, they come back. And you think about this: COVID-19 is going to end. This wave is going to end, and we're going to go back to a different normal. It's never going to go back to the way it was. The people living in Europe are never going to go back to the Europe the way it was after the plague, but they're going to go back to something. And what we choose to do with it is up to us. So why not go back and look at, just like they did with Greece and Roman stuff, look at what worked in the past, look at what part of life worked. And I'm not saying totally do away with our lives now, but we're not going to go back to where we were. They did not go back to where they were. So you have to figure out some way to move forward. So those three things on the left, and then over here on the right, the rich and the wealthy, because they're rich and wealthy, can support artists. And now painters and sculptors can do this as a profession. This is a new thing during this time period of actually doing art as a profession, because now people will pay you. Patrons are those who support you. We give to a couple small local theaters here. We're patrons of the arts. We don't give a lot, but we do give some because art needs to flourish. You need to be artistic. You guys should all take art classes. That half of the brain needs exercise too. Even if you can't draw, just to give that side some exercise. Another change during this time period was science and technology. And again, remember, those are general terms. This is technology. But before this was the old school wooden pencil, also technology. Anything that makes work easier. And some of that comes back from the Crusades, because the Muslims were, remember, the first universities, the first medical school. The Chinese invented everything. So these comes back, and people begin to think and question what can we do with this? How can we move forward? How can we not have a plague again? And then just the idea that the world and the natural world around us can be beautiful, that things are pretty, and that there's nothing wrong with acknowledging art or beauty for beauty's sake. And so this idea of recapturing the glory of Rome from that point, not from the empire building, slave owning, conquering Roman Empire, but from the glory, because they built beautiful things, and there were facets of the Roman Empire that were worth celebrating. So these six things are why the Renaissance occurs when it occurs, because you had to have the plague, you had to have the Crusades for this to happen. Just like without the Crusades and without the Renaissance, the exploration would have gone a different way, and that's where we're going after this. Again, some of the major cities during this time period in Italy, and remember, Italy is not a country during this time period. All these little states, all these little borders on this map, they're all individual states that will eventually make up Italy when we get to the 1800s. But Italy's not a country right now. Venice, Milan, Florence, the Papal States, that's that purple area, that's the Pope's land. The Kingdom of Naples, because they're that fancy, that's down here. Florence, which is up, see if I can find Florence for you. All right, point. That's the Republic of Venice, Milan, Savoy, Florence. I'm sorry, I'm blind. It's the yellow one above Tuscany, just to the west of the Papal States. That was run by the Medici family. There was I think a Netflix or an HBO show about the Medici family. And also that leads us to a guy named Machiavelli, who wanted to work for the Medici family and wrote a book actually called The Prince, and it's about how to be an effective ruler. All right, and we'll come to him in a minute. Now, profit making becomes more important than what the church has to say. So that's a change. To overcome this guilt of making all this money, we get philanthropists, and all that is somebody who gives to organizations. They give charity or they give to the arts. It's just to be a philanthropist is somebody who takes their money and gives it to causes that they deem necessary. It can be charity, can be performances, could be universities. But it's just giving money because they feel so guilty for being wealthy because you're almost coveting. You can see there's a dilemma here. You're almost like, ooh, money, 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 money. Oh no, wait, God says no. So they're wrestling with this in the Renaissance. Those people with money. For the people without money, there's no wrestling at all. It's just God. So how do you handle this? How do you make yourself feel better for being so wealthy? You give. And you see that with celebrities today. Now, I don't know if they're guilty, but maybe some of them are. The other thing we start getting now really clearly defined is social strategy is clearly defined with larger gaps, especially at the top of social classes. And because different classes had different money, as the last part of the slide shows, and if you can't see it because of my ugly mug, I'll tell you what it says. Excuse me. If I am less wealthy than you, then there may be two different pairs of shoes and one's cheaper than the other. You start getting diversified products to target diversified clients, different audiences. So again, as one job is created, other jobs are created. This is a very generic, general principle in economics. One job creates other jobs. Go back all the way to the beginning of our course together, which we haven't spent enough time together. We talked about the factors of a civilization. Once we stop moving and make our villages, we build a wall. Well, we got to have people to build the wall, and we got to have people to make the bricks. We got to have people to stand guard. And we got to have people to. So one job can beget others if the situation allows it. Questions? Okay. Now, art changes. And by the way, some of you who did some of the assignments online early, my fault. I should have done this and then released them because some of this information can help you answer the questions more fully. Art now becomes a way to show how wealthy you are, so art becomes a status symbol. Art also leads to competition amongst artists. Again, you can make money now. It also leads to competition amongst people. So I may see Da Vinci that I want, and you may see Da Vinci that you want, Morgan. And if I can get it before you do, then I'm better than you. Or, I don't know, Luz, you may be able to get your hands on Rodin, and I can't. So there was competition for that. Another thing, remember going back to some of the changes, and one of them was the idea of science and experimentation. Well, we begin to look at anatomy, because that is part of science, differently. And the body, and there's a much more of a desire and an attempt to make people look more realistic. They're three-dimensional, they're more active, they're much more true to life than earlier painting and earlier time periods. And part of that is because of how we approach science. All right? Some of the themes of Renaissance art, again, the idea of humanism, that I have value and there's beauty in the world. There is some secularism, the idea that secular means of the world. So there's theological and there's secular. There's religious and there's secular. That's the easiest way to think about them. So there's a much more worldview about things in the art, and much more here's what's going on. Not necessarily opinion or what's the word? Like critique in their art, but just notice that it's more real life. the individual matters and how the individual looks, and the makeup and the hands, not makeup, but how the body. And then the idea of free will, which is, again, very religious, because those of you, I can't speak to Muslims, and I can't speak to Hebrews, but I think it's the same. Christianity expresses free will. There's not predestination in some churches. Some believe that, some don't. But you are free to choose God or not. Man is free to make the choices man makes. That's what free will is. Doesn't mean there's no consequence, but man is free to make those choices. Now, what else was different in early Renaissance art? Again, realism, the concept of perspective. And those of you taking Art 1 know what that is. And those of you who haven't taken Art 1 yet, that's the idea of three-dimensional. It's the idea of depth of field, those types of things. Depth of field, okay? Classical themes, like going back to Greece and Rome and painting or sculpting on those themes again. Using geometry to actually line up a picture so that the eyes always follow you in a painting. The idea of symmetry, all those things come about during this time period because they're bringing back the math and the science that the Muslims have kept, that the Greeks used, and our great Greek mathematicians. The edges are softened, there's background and foreground, and the bottom tells you you could make a living as an artist now. Not a great living, but you could make a living, and you can make a living while you were alive back then. The goal would be to have some rich person basically support you, or what's the word? Help me out here. What's the word? Subsidize or keep you afloat. They're the ones, you work for them, they pay you, you give them art. That's not the word I'm looking for, but you get it. All right, now here it is, people, right here. Pay attention. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, no ifs, ands, or buts. You're all wrong. This is the most significant, important, and influential invention in the history of mankind. None greater, none more important. None. The printing press. The single most important. You can at me all you want. No. This guy named Gutenberg allowed for, because remember, prior to this guy and prior to this machine, if you wanted it, it was handwritten by hand by one of 5 monks who probably knew how to write in a monastery. Paper was expensive, ink was expensive. In fact, paper was so expensive that if they wanted to write a new story, they would scratch out all the old ink and write over it. So there are stories that are lost to mankind because paper was expensive and books were expensive. A year's salary would go into a book. But now we can print more. By 1500, 40,000 titles were printed. And that's different titles. That's not books. That's 40,000 different books, stories, pamphlets, 8 to 10 million copies. One, when you can print more of something, you know what happens to the price. Answer. Two, the movable type allows different types of works to be written. We can now do research, and more people are going to read, because if a book is less expensive, you can get it in more hands. And the other thing, and I don't know if it's on the next slide or not, but the other thing that really matters is this. The language books begin to be written in is in the language of the vernacular. In other words, and I believe that's the vocabulary. So I will say it, and then you can pause this and write it down. The vernacular language is the local language of a region. Prior to this explosion, every Bible was pretty much written in Latin. And if you couldn't read Latin, oh well. But people could read German, and people could read French and speak various forms of Italian and other local languages and Romansh languages. And so when books began being printed in native, local, vernacular languages, everybody's reading. And pretty much it's the Bible for most people. But those with money can read other things. And this, again, this furthers that explosion and expansion of unknown things becoming known. And so this, the printing, I'm telling you, printing press, hands down, most important invention in the history of mankind. You are not here without a printing press. There's no computer without a printing press. Tell it. All right, don't worry about the crash course. All right, this is the guy I was talking about before, Machiavelli. All right. He was a writer. He wrote a book called The Prince. A couple of things, 2 quotes attributed to Machiavelli. One, it's better to be feared than loved. So as a ruler, it's better that people fear you than love you. He believed in that. And he also believed that the ends justified the means, that whatever you needed to be done, whatever it took to get that done, was okay if you reached your goal. It's 1513, and to a degree, maybe. And we can, and if we, and after the 15th of May, when we're back together, we can talk about him because we'll have time, I think. All right. So these are just excerpts from the church. Go back and read this on your own, and then answer these 2 questions. And I may make a comment box somewhere in Canvas, or I'll put them in there for discussion, and we can talk about those. All right. So the first one is, do you agree? And explain your answer. That's an opinion, so that's kind of cool. And then in the reading, it talks about how a ruler should be analogous or like a fox. And then do you agree with that? So just use the reading, answer these questions. They're opinion questions, nothing to be afraid of. All right, and have at it. All right, and guess what, ladies and gentlemen? That is all for today. That is the early Renaissance. Tomorrow we will, I will record the next part of the Renaissance. There's a couple left, and then we'll move on to other things. Until then, I look forward to seeing you, and have a great day.